Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we talk to nonprofit leader Jay Hein about innovative social impact investing, religion, and social policy. And what the George W. Bush White House got right. Let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, social entrepreneurs, historians, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. We also sprinkle in practical advice for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers. My name is Jeremy Beer, and thanks for joining us. All right. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. We are recording on May 24th, 2022. As usual, I am in Phoenix, Arizona, where it will be under 100 degrees today, so I have no complaints. And I am happy to have as our guest today, Jay Hein, president of Sagamore Institute and former director of the White House Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. Jay Hein co-founded the Sagamore Institute in 2004 with former U.S. Senator Dan Coats. As part of his Sagamore duties, Jay also serves as managing director of an impact investing platform called Commonwealth. We're going to talk quite a bit about this initiative today. We'll also talk to Jay about his time in the Bush White House, where as a senior advisor to President Bush, he managed the implementation of a determined attack on need with staff, dozen cabinet agencies. We'll find out what a determined attack on need is. And finally, it's worth noting that Jay is the former director of civil society programs at the Hudson Institute, and that he served as a welfare policy advisor to then Wisconsin Governor Tommy Thompson. Jay is also the author of The Quiet Revolution and The New Wisconsin Idea. Those are two separate books. He received his undergraduate degree at Eureka College. He has an honorary Doctor of Laws from Indiana Wesleyan University, and he serves as a senior fellow at the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University. Jay Hein, welcome.
Jeremy, I'm really delighted to be with you. Thanks for having me as a guest. It's
a very impressive resume. You have a very impressive background and career, so it's our honor to have you on with us. So I thought we'd start first with your experience at the Bush White House and kind of go on talking about maybe a little bit about religion and domestic policy and civil society from there. And then we'll talk about Sagamore and Commonwealth, because this conversation has a little bit for everybody, givers, doers, and thinkers, all three categories today. So let's start with the Bush White House. Because the formation of the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, I remember when that happened. It was a big deal when it happened. You wrote a book about your time there and what you learned, called The Quiet Revolution, an active faith that transforms lives and communities. Perhaps we could begin by your taking listeners back to how the office came about, how you came to be involved with it, and kind of what was the controversy that surrounded its formation?
Sure. There's several chapters of this story we may want to explore together. So you continue to guide me. I'd like to start, though, more in the think tank environment before we get to the White House, if that's all right.
Yep.
Because you referenced my work in welfare reform, and I've noticed past guests like Mike Hartman and Alicia Manning and others that were actors in that play back in the 1990s when I was serving Tommy Thompson. It's really where the story begins, and I won't burden you with tons of detail, but I want to sort of skip across a few lily pads on I maybe call it the intellectual origins of the faith-based initiative. George Bush, as he was campaigning for governor of Texas, actually, in the early 90s, was really influenced by Myron Magnet, who you'll recall at Manhattan Institute, and the Dream and the Nightmare in particular, thinking about just the cultural disruption that he observed in New York City and how it negatively impacted the underclass. And Marvin Olasky wrote Tragedy of American Compassion, which was just a reminder that the state isn't superior in problem solving in neighborhoods, that neighbors are more exceptional at that, and really calling for a revival of the little platoons, Berger and Newhouse. All of those ideas were swirling quite a lot. in the welfare reform conversation, where we were trying to think about what to do with the unintended consequences of the welfare state, which began, of course, post-World War II with speed, trying to address the complexities of society and what became the underclass. Unfortunately, the state, did overreach and did more for the poor than empowering the poor to do for themselves. And so welfare reform in many respects was an attempt to remedy that, figuring out the modest and right-sized role of the state as a safety net for those truly in need, but more of an empowering agent. So the literature that George Bush was reading were the same books and conversations that we're having to try and shift from entitlement welfare to more of a system of empowerment, neighborhood-based.
It was sort of a generation after the Great Society. I guess now that we have some distance from this time, I suppose this was sort of, it was a reaction against really the utter failure of the Great Society agenda and programs. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting you brought that up. I was thinking the other day about conservatism, and we've sort of lost some of the nuances of the philosophical tenets in today's political clamor. But I was sort of toying with the notion of conservatives maybe pursuing the good society, and maybe the liberal side of the conversation pursuing more the great society, and the good society, the good, the true, the beautiful, really the dignity that comes with for those of faith, seeing Imago Dei, each of us made in God's image, but otherwise just agency. Our neighbors being capable of so much more, and the best part, the best intentions, if you will, of the great society would be just this centralized, top-down, let us care for you better, which I do think comes from good motives, and I do think produces bad outcomes because of the evidence that you're referring to. And that's why I called it unintended consequences. Of course, in the Great Depression, FDR's launch of these policies were needed. By single moms, say, and in that day, who were not welcome in the workforce, but who were hungry and needed to care for their kids. And yet he warned of the emerging welfare state becoming a narcotic. And finding that balance, I think really two negative lines of trajectory flew through the Great Society. One was intergenerational welfare dependence, and the other became a crowding out of religion in the public square. For different reasons, those two trend lines became a big problem for poverty fighters. Many of whom are motivated by their faith, and then the overreach of the state in providing their sort of a state-centered form of compassion. So as we in the 1990s were calling for effective compassion, was the term we were using back then. It was really one that was centered on empowerment strategies rather than entitlement provision.
I remember, at least at the time. So there were two sort of reactions on the center right to the failure or the creation of this, as you put it, of intergenerational welfare dependency, crowding out of religion in the public square. One was let's just get the state, roll everything back, get the state out of everything, return to the small state of the pre-war state. And the other was what you all, I would say, this sort of generation of neoconservatives, I think it's fair to say, was sort of a very policy-oriented, practical sort of cohort of people who thought there was a better way. And you're touching on it here. I just want to bring that out, that you could do policy in an empowering way, not in any sort of dependency-creating way. Is that a fair way to frame things?
Yeah, for sure. I'll bring another actor on the stage. So in 1994, Dan Coates, who you referenced as Sagamore Institute's co-founder, super privileged to work with him for a couple of decades now. But in 1994, he was standing with Bill Bennett and Jack Kemp, during the Gingrich Revolution, saying, look, we're conservatives and we believe in a smaller state, and tax reform and really a lot of the conservative policy canon on fiscal integrity. At the same time, we understand there are many of our neighbors not in the winner circle who are hurting, and we need to be innovative and aggressive in meeting their needs as well. And that is more of a private sector set of strategies than it is a state-centered set of strategies. But they hit this philosophical point. I think it was Bill Bennett said the problem with liberals is they look at the poor and see a victim, and the problem with conservatives is they look at the poor and see an alien. And we just need to see them as our neighbor. And so that was super motivating to me and a lot of the rising generation of sort of policy analysts who are working on this, thinking how do we right-size strategy to reweave the safety net, so the state has this more modest role. It looked like welfare reform. So what we had to do is not only pass a new set of laws that incentivized work and marriage and other pro-social behaviors, but also re-engineered the social service delivery system, if you will. I mean, if you're a trained welfare worker in the 80s, you're sitting behind a computer proving how poor someone is so that they can qualify for a bunch of benefits. And now in the 90s, we're asking them to ask questions of this person about what they're interested in, what they're good at, how they might be able to migrate from this really choppy lifestyle into one that's more stable, and what work preparation that is required, but also maybe some educational or social support that's needed as well. That was probably the harder work, as much as it was a beast to change state policy first, and then the 1996 welfare law. It was harder to change that service delivery system culture, and it's an unfinished work. But it was from that policy debate and in the 1996 law that a second provision, not only the empowerment set of policies from welfare that really sort of accelerated welfare to work, but there was a provision called charitable choice that really enlarged the conversation about the role of faith-based institutions in all of this. And it was really the beginning of attacking the second negative trend line, which is the crowding out of religion in the public square, not to show favoritism to faith-based charities, but to create equal treatment was the language back in the day.
Of course, equal treatment was exactly what certain sort of segment of society did not want. Right? They read the Constitution as requiring unequal treatment, as keeping religion utterly separate from the state. What were the key? Were there cases or key decisions, laws that helped kind of break through that particular reading of the Constitution, or that prejudice, maybe?
Well, there were a series of important legal precedents established and some administrative rule, and we can dig into those fields a little bit as much as you'd like. You're speaking to a non-lawyer, so I won't say this with great authority.
One non-lawyer between us. Yeah. We could play one on TV maybe, but I would rather start again with a book and culture change. So Stephen Carter, who you may know, Yale law professor, whose fiction books are amazing, by the way, I love them. He wrote a book called The Culture of Disbelief. Clinton famously had it under his arm as he took one of his Martha's Vineyard vacations, as I recall, which brought some public attention to the book. But Carter's thesis was the only acceptable prejudice in America was religious discrimination. Right.
And that captures the point you're making, and it's true. And so this is I think where George Bush becomes the main actor on the play, because he was working out some of the tension in both of these trend lines I'm referring to that led to welfare reform and what became known as the faith-based initiative as governor of Texas. There's some really interesting subplots to that story about Chuck Colson's prison in Houston and an interesting event at the Alamo with our friend Bob Woodson and Mark Molaski. Maybe we can touch on, but it led to him just fully appreciating muscular role that small neighborhood faith-based organizations perform. And you may recall there were a number of church burnings in Texas that were horrific during his gubernatorial time. And he would show up with Tony Evans often at these events and just describe how horrible they were to the rest of the state. And finally, Tony Evans looked at him and said, well, I appreciate that, Governor, and that you're here, but you need to realize you really can't fix this. And George Bush is thinking, I'm governor, I'm a Bush. What do you mean I can't fix this? And Tony Evans said, this is the church, this is culture. And it was really just I think an eye opener for the governor then to say, that's right. And as governor, I could draw attention to that, maybe accelerate it a bit, but that's your role. And so back to the Carter book and where George Bush, enters the scene is for his time as governor, for his campaign, which maybe we could say a word about because he created philosophical architecture in his first policy address that I think was super instructive to this conversation. But then, for 8 years as president, so call it, 15 years of public life, he would drape his arm around an inner city pastor and say, Pastor, when you serve your neighbor, you serve your state in Texas or your nation. And I guess in Texas, they think that's a nation. So, you serve your neighbor, you serve your nation. And that changed culture. And I think that's the headline of the Faith-Based Initiative. When Carter wrote that book, I think he was right that religious discrimination was just an accepted norm. But, after 15 years from the mid-90s on for President Bush through, 2008, he led a culture change that brought faith-based into the vernacular. That wasn't a term we used in the 90s or before.
You may not remember that, but that was not at all in the language until.
No. And faith was a presumed negative, back to the Carter thesis. Whereas when I was director of the office, 2006 to 2008, I had so many pastors and faith-based leaders come up to me and say, before this initiative, I was either ignored or deemed suspect in the public square. And now I'm like the first call, like a first responder kind of call, and oftentimes seen as the solution. Would you thank the president for me? So I really think that, not to put a halo around it altogether, there were stumbles and challenges, of course, and yet that culture change is the headline, I believe. And we're on a different, trend line now as a result of that culture change.
Oh, okay. So how would you describe that trend line that we're on now?
Well, I think that faith-based actors, so 501c3 organizations and churches are exactly what I heard from those that approached me when I was in office, that they're more welcome than they were before because of the series of court cases that advanced equal treatment, and the initiative itself, which was established through a series of executive orders that placed staff not only in the White House, but in a dozen or so federal agencies whose job it was to change administrative rule. So again, not to favor religious organizations, but to, find that balance in the First Amendment about, protecting religious liberty while not establishing state religion. So I think equal treatment is, far more accessible today. I won't say it's achieved, but it's far more accessible today. And before the Bush White House, if you were St. Mary, by definition, you were unwelcome to compete for many grants in the federal government. Now you are welcome to compete in a way that you weren't before. And I think that's a meaningful point, but a point subordinate to the primary point that you look at many institutions and many leading voices that cross the political spectrum from left to right, and you see a healthier appreciation for the role of faith in the public square. Byron Johnson, my colleague at Baylor, likes to talk about the pro-social role of religion in society. It's much more evidence-based, it's much more politically accepted, and it's much more culturally appreciated than it was 20 years ago.
So I work with a lot of nonprofit leaders of faith-based organizations. I want to get your take on this. They continue to, there is among them, even after all the positive change you just described, still where at least a wariness, if not bordering on fear, of what government support might mean for their programs and practices, and how they might have to change things, where they have to conceal certain beliefs. And this has only intensified considerably in the last few years, to the extent that right now, I think there's this massive amount of COVID money floating around at the state governmental level, coming from the feds, and the county level, municipal level. There's more than can be given away. And I'm aware of a number of faith-based leaders who are being pleaded with by government officials to take some money and don't want to do it. What do you make of that? Are they right to have some wariness, or is that have things changed for the worse in the last few years, in other words? Or is that just an older point of view that they shouldn't be so worried, they shouldn't take anymore?
No, I definitely think they should be worried. But let's maybe characterize this in two different forms of maybe discomfort. One is faith, and the other is size. So for faith-based organizations, I mean, as I said, equal treatment is more accessible. Government doing outreach to faith-based groups to participate is different than government saying you're not welcome here.
Right.
So from a policy level, that's a more level playing field. But while we were in office, and I would continue to hold the same position, that the faith-based initiative was not about government grant making first. It was about this determined attack on need, which maybe we can get back to in a bigger picture point in a little while. But these sort of policy points and this grant making is super, super important to think well about. And if your theology, is super clear and super strong about evangelism, certain other sort of tenets or faith that are not compatible, with, the terms of a government grant, you do not want money or an actor, a customer who's going to compromise that or just challenge it. And so you need to think about whether, Uncle Sam's dollar is right for you. Oftentimes it's not. You should rely on provision from private philanthropy rather than government. Many times, and in other times, this is very situational. The delivery of certain services is very safe for you to take the dollars. And so there's no blunt sort of answer to whether to take government money or not, but to be super sophisticated about your filters, what's acceptable and what's unacceptable before you even proceed. And that's a faith tenet set of questions. But then there's also just the size. I mean, one of the bigger challenges we face that receive lesser attention is that, the big and the large and the impersonal of the federal government doesn't, congeal nicely with the dynamism, the entrepreneurial nature, the grittiness of a small nonprofit. And so just the grant making process itself is just beastly and cumbersome to apply for, to implement, and to, report. And so government is oftentimes maybe not the right funding source for many smaller grassroots organizations. We did mini grant programs and some other reforms to get closer. The use of intermediaries, we think, is the stronger. The Compassion Capital Fund was an attempt to enlarge that field. Those are all, I think, smart public policies. But oftentimes, if you're a small grassroots organization, it's just not worth it to deal with the bureaucracy of government. And so, for two reasons, I'd be wary, and therefore in agreement. But it doesn't mean it's a non-starter.
Right. That's very wise advice indeed. We need to go to a break and talk a little bit of practicalities, but we'll be right back with Jay Hein of the Sagamore Institute. right, time for one of our practicalities. I'm very happy to have with us today my colleague, Ben Domain. How are you doing, Ben?
Doing well.
Ben is a managing consultant for us out of our Denver office. He understands major gifts very, very well, and he understands what it's like to grind very, very well because he was once a center for a little football team down there in Baton Rouge. I think it's LSU Tigers, something like that.
That's it.
Yeah, I've heard of them. It's a program that has done some things. In fact, it won a national championship, I think, while you were there. Is that right?
Yep. We went to the national championship and I won an SEC championship with them.
All right. So this is championship level advice that you're about to get from Ben Domain, who works out of our Denver office. I can't remember if I said that yet. Ben, we're going to talk about, this is for all the major gifts people out there, whether you're a major gift officer, a VP of advancement, director of development, CEO, president of a nonprofit. You're going to be doing major gifts at some point, which means you're going to be asking somebody for a lot of money. What are a couple of questions that you hear a lot from clients about this that kind of gives them heartburn? They're not exactly sure how to answer them.
Yep. It's a great question, Jeremy. I would say my two top frequently asked questions in this arena is, well, how do you know how much to ask for? And where can I find that $1 million donor? I think those are my top two.
Okay, let's take them one at a time.
That's great. I think the question, how do you know how much to ask for? A friend of mine who's a veteran in the field in major gifts fundraising, he said once, if you ask the right questions and listen, people will tell you how they like to give their money away, when they like to, and what they like to support. And you kind of hear that flippantly, and you're like, that's not the reality, but it's true. I think we as fundraising professionals are, quote, scared to probe, right? Mm-hmm. But in all reality, if we treat these people as philanthropists, like they are, that they actually like to give money away, we should ask them questions, and we should ask them what we call them the golden questions. What do you like to give? What do you like to support? How much and when, right? And if we ask those questions, I think it's analogous to if we ran an investment firm for high net worth investors, and we never ask those investors what they like to fund, right?
Yeah, it's funny that we're obviously would be very comfortable if we were an investment firm talking to investors, talking about those kinds of questions. But for some reason, when it's a philanthropist, we don't see them in the same light. That's a really interesting point.
Absolutely. And then the second question of where you can find that $1 million donor, honestly, more than likely, they're already in your donor portfolio or your house file mail. And everyone is looking for that Warren Buffett donor, right? Who's the Catholic Warren Buffett? Who's my free market Warren Buffett? And chances are, very rarely does a brand new donor drop such significant cash into your organization at the get-go, right? Because you have to take time to build that trust and share that your organization is meritorious of receiving that, right? You'll actually have better luck at growing an existing donor who's already giving and already loves your mission. So
why is that so hard for people to understand, Ben? We get this a lot. Why do people have trouble believing that?
I think they don't. I think because of what they see is that person may be just giving $25 a month, and if he really loved us, he would already be investing deeply. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of where the question comes from, right? And they think in terms of, I need to go whale hunting, which I think you should do. Go whale hunting. You can feed a village if you kill a whale. Now, you could also go starving. So
it's a high risk strategy. When you can also feed a village by fishing off the pier.
So true. True.
Is there something that people should know about? Is there how to find that person within their portfolio who's most likely to be that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would look at a handful of factors. I would look at like how long they've been giving, if they've jumped to different projects over time, their lifetime giving, how much they have given in their lifetime, any indicators that show affinity, right? I think going back to the giving formula, generosity equals capacity, someone's capacity, times by affinity, times by emotional engagement. right? So, and it's up to you to drive emotional engagement. Their capacity is already there that you don't know, but you can look for that affinity within the organization by their giving habits.
Love it, Ben. That's wise LSU advice right there.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Jeremy.
All right, we are back talking to Jay Hein, co-founder of the Sagamore Institute, former director of the Bush White House's Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, managing director of something called Commonwealth, an investing platform, which we'll talk about in a second. And let's go ahead and shift, even though we could talk about the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives and what it did for much, much longer. But I'm going to go ahead and shift this now in the interest of time towards Sagamore Institute, which probably ties into the previous story, what we were talking about. One of the things, first I'd like to give us like a little bit like how the Sagamore Institute came into being and what its mission is. And then maybe you could talk about what's unique about it, at least from my perspective, sort of the way you connect. You don't just do ideas, you connect innovators to the ideas people and vice versa for sort of a fruitful interchange. So I know that's a lot, but I'll.
Awesome. I'd love to jump in on that. And maybe it's a bit of a segue from where we were in the faith-based initiative to the think tank history I've been privileged to be a part of. I moved from Governor Thompson's office on welfare reform to the Hudson Institute, first in Madison, Wisconsin, because Hudson had located an office in Madison to support Thompson's reform agenda. Bradley Foundation was a key part of that story. That's when I worked with some of our mutual friends, mid-90s. And then I moved to Indianapolis to work at Hudson's headquarters. And that's when I pivoted post the 96 reform laws to a civil society program portfolio and enlarged the conversation beyond government policies that would empower the poor and make the public square more welcoming to faith-based organizations where we were before, but really taking on bigger questions upstream about culture, about the role of the marketplace, and the neighborhood-based actors, social entrepreneurs. We would have more referred to them back then, and really the passion that Dan Coates and I had is to bring business solutions to giving and serving in America. So he came out of the Senate in the late 90s, took his leftover campaign funds, and created a foundation called the Foundation for American Renewal that sort of a private sector twin to the Project for American Renewal, which is the 1994 package that I referred to early in the earlier segment, and asked me to sort of quarterback that work for him. He became U.S. Ambassador to Germany and went to Berlin. I think his second day or third day on the job was 9/11. So he had a very consequential season over there. And I used the foundation to do just what he and I were interested in, which is to think about how we could move philanthropy, unthinking philanthropy, into smarter social investment and how to help nonprofits become stronger businesses. So really kind of gritty work that you do on a day-to-day basis, Jeremy, so powerfully, and that we were pursuing in research, a bit in policy, but more just in innovative practice. Mm-hmm. And so that was the foundation. Unexpectedly to us, in 2004, Hudson pivoted its headquarters presence from Indianapolis to Washington, D.C. Dan was still in Germany, but I chatted with him and said, we've loved our time at Hudson, but rather than becoming more of a field office to Hudson as its headquarters was in DC, maybe we would be better off building a separate institution that would dig deeper in the upper Midwest soil and yet continue our national policy work, indeed our global presence under a new name, and that is Sagamore Institute. So in some respects, we were the 21st year since Hudson arrived in Indianapolis in 84 and was there 20 years. In some respects, we were the 21st year of that think tank experiment, a national policy think tank in the heartland. And Sagamore just continued that good work in the best we knew how, and have expanded it since.
You make a great effort to act in a not just a nonpartisan way, of course, but a cross-partisan way. I would say very intentional. How has your ability to do that waxed and or waned over the last 18 or 21 years? If you want to give that length of time to it, or are you more encouraged now than ever? Are you more discouraged now than ever?
Well, I would say maybe that our premise was confirmed, or sort of affirmed more than ever, because the work we've been able to do has grown while our political discourse has fragmented. So I think what that means is, what was sort of confirmed is that we had the idea as we launched Sagamore that national was bigger than federal, which we thought was sort of a confused point. That many Americans thought of our nation as sort of equal to whatever happens in Washington, who we elect, what Congress enacts, and who wins and loses our elections. And all of that matters so much, of course. But national is just simply way bigger, as the founders intended. The citizen is the primary actor. And, all we do in cities and states are, create jobs and educate kids and deliver healthcare and, lead America. And so, the State of the Union is stronger in communities than it is in elite institutions and in Washington, D.C. And so much of Sagamore's work is in the marketplace and in community renewal strategies. And so innovation is happening, and there's so much hope that's found. There's much more civil discourse. We are big believers that government closer to the people works best. And so our, sort of prioritizing our work with governors and mayors from public policy and policy implementation standpoint is uninterrupted. But the landscape's rockier, and it does matter, what the president says and the leadership that's offered from Washington. And so the marketplace of ideas, is just a harder place to do business than it was 20 years ago. As we, have a harder time listening to each other and all the challenges in the national conversation. But I'm not fatalistic about it. And I believe that we're not going to argue our way to a better place. I think we're going to demonstrate our way to a better place. And we just need to get more of us from the bottom up with higher expectations, a little more hope, and a little more action. The founders did believe educated and engaged citizens were the answer, and we still believe that deeply.
It is a salutary reminder and very encouraging, right, for everyone. It's so easy to get drawn into the sort of toxic national conversation, and to think that that's America, and that's sort of some sort of representative slice of what's happening everywhere, and it's not. And that's a very good point you make, that on the ground, at the grassroots level, at a community level, civil society can still function, and civil discourse can still happen. Both. Is that partly a function of being in the heartland, you think? And what sort of future do you see for that part of the country? Because you make a big deal about being, in the heartland. What sort of future do you see there? I've been, my own sort of thesis has been that, Fort Wayne and Peoria and Des Moines, their days have arrived perhaps now with everything that's happened in the last couple of years. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah. Well, you're right. We do make a very big deal about being of the heartland. It's probably, though, as much kind of metaphor and symbol as it is geography. And so we love our home base in Indianapolis. I still have a strong family presence in Wisconsin, but I think the bigger point is human scale. That's where we prioritize, because we work at human scale in Kigali, Rwanda, as much as we do in Indianapolis, Indiana. And this is just, I think, rather than just place, although place matters a whole lot, it's bringing entrepreneurial solutions to the world's biggest problems. And when you're in that business, which is the heart of where Sagamore meets Commonwealth, it's a super hopeful place. I mean, to be able to see brilliant thinking and gritty hard work, thrown against, we sort of teed up, but didn't hit the ball on the determined attack on need back to the faith-based initiative. But, this was the point, is to declare the world's, biggest problems unacceptable, and then to get after it with the best actors who could do something about it. And that's what we get to do on a day-to-day basis, which is why we're so encouraged. Take, for example, Jalen Smith. You mentioned Fort Wayne, Indiana, up the road from where I live. This is a kid that grew up in a pretty tough part of town, but was good at football, went to Notre Dame, played for the Cowboys, went to a Pro Bowl, and used his platform to create the Minority Entrepreneurship Institute to say, look, while the debate is raging over, the tragedy of George Floyd, and many people paying attention to whose fault it is, the racial tension, Jalen said, I want to be on the solution side of the equation. And we think the wealth gap is unacceptable, which is 10x in America between white net worth and black net worth. Mm-hmm. And we think, Jalen and I, because we're partners in this work, the best idea, literally the best idea to close the wealth gap is to invest in a minority entrepreneur, a black or brown founder of a company who's going to create intergenerational wealth. There's just no better way. And so that's hard work. It's hard work because it isn't Des Moines Day yet, to tease a bit about the way you teed it up, because venture capital, resides in Silicon Valley, New York, and Boston at some 95% level or something like that. So we're trying to bring venture capital out to the heartland, if you will, which is the rest of America, into entrepreneurs like we're serving at the MEI with Jalen. And that's really hard work. But it's super inspiring work.
Hey, dive into the model. So you started to explain Commonwealth, just so everybody understands. I sort of spoke about that earlier, and I said we talk about it. And here's why I want givers' ears to perk up, because if you think of yourself as an investor as much as a giver, you'll be very interested in this. Explain the model, Jay, what you're doing.
Sure. So in the sort of historic arc of what I'm talking about, from Hudson to Sagamore, you also get to now see some dots connect from Dan Coates Foundation, which has become Commonwealth. 20 years ago, we were interested in bringing business solutions to philanthropy and nonprofit performance. We're still interested in that, but that's not our priority focus. Our priority focus changed to operate through this vehicle, separate 501c3 called Commonwealth, to prize impact investing as the strategy. So we're thinking about how to bring both donor advised fund capital, so that's charitable capital, alongside private capital from your balance sheet, private investments, into companies who are solving some of the world's biggest problems. So Commonwealth is an impact investing platform. The term of art is that we use special purpose vehicles or investment vehicles for partners such as Jalen and the Minority Entrepreneurship Institute, where we form capital around investment strategies that produce both strong economic gain. So whether to you, on behalf of your donor advised fund or on behalf of your private balance sheet, we're creating more wealth for the investor while we're demonstrating in a meaningful and measurable way a positive social result. So somehow we're solving, some of the public's biggest problems.
Yeah. So just to kind of make sure everybody understands, slow to make sure I understand. So I have $1 million in a DAF, donor advised fund. I'm giving that money away. Everybody realizes that's it's sitting at Fidelity or sitting at Bradley Impact Fund or Donors Trust or whatever. I can direct some of that money toward this company, like a minority entrepreneurship institute. Does it have to be a nonprofit
Yeah.
company? Okay.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. So,
Okay.
so let's say, so Jalen and I are investing in this company, for example, in Orlando. One of our favorite investments is called Nestra. It's a brain science company, super innovative, creating well-being. It's helping football players recover from concussions, but it's helping all human beings just become higher performing individuals, and sort of into this tech and wellness space, sort of Jalen's brand as a professional athlete. So we're participating on a Series A round with them, where we're raising capital to join Adi Dassler, which is the family office for the Adidas family, which is the strategic lead of this investment. So we're raising capital, and we say to Jeremy, do you care about this Black founder, Tommy Shavers, who we admire, who we think is really amazing, came out of a sports tech accelerator in Lake Nona in Orlando, and forming partnerships with the likes of Tom Brady and the TB12 company that he operates. So it's a really high-end performing company, and Tommy's going to attack the wealth gap through various strategies we could explain to you, and he's also just going to improve the human experience through his technology. And you're like, I'm in. I love this. I believe in the excellence of the operator and the economics of the deal and the social impact. I'm in, says Jeremy. And I say, great, Jeremy, what pocket would you like to use to make this investment through Commonwealth? You could use your charitable capital. If you have $1 million in your donor advised fund, congratulations, by the way, proves you've been successful in the market.
Yeah.
So you could send that dollar, say, and you're like, yes, I'd like to use $100,000 from my DAF. So I'd say, great. You could grant $100,000 from Fidelity to Commonwealth, which is a 501c3. We could receive that grant, and then we would pool that capital with the, say, $5 million that we're raising for investment into Nestra. And as Nestra pays off through an equity conversion or a simple loan, whatever we construct with Nestra, I will replenish the capital of your donor advised fund with the profit. So you send me a grant for 100, I send you a grant back for 100 plus profit. Or if you wanted to use your private capital, you just operate very typically as a private investor. Or of course, you might use both. And many of our investors use both pockets.
I don't think this is done a whole lot, but just to make sure everybody understands. So yeah, it's really quite remarkable, the idea that you can use, if you're a giver, you give away your money to your DAF, you get what tax advantages accrue to you for that. Then you can direct it to be given as a grant to a 501c3 that uses it for some great social good, and it can be returned to your DAF. So it's I think that's a new concept for many givers, that their $100,000 isn't just gone forever. It maybe did great good along the way, but could come back to them with interest and having done good along the way. That's kind of game changing.
Well, it is game changing, and it goes back to bringing sort of smart new strategies to the practice of philanthropy. As you know, donor advised funds are a fast growing tool in the toolkit in American philanthropy. I think there's something in the neighborhood of $130 billion assets under management in these various donor advised funds, growing dramatically every year. And as you said, that money has been gifted, so it's never going to come back to any private benefit of the donor. But what do you do? I mean, especially if you get a big exit, you make a big gift, or you in any other way just accumulate. Many of our friends have tens of millions of dollars in their donor advised funds, which have replaced in many respects the old family foundation. There are still some of those, but many more wealth holders are using DAFs. It's just so easy and low cost. But if you don't have business intelligence on what to do with that capital, the same way you'd have business intelligence to direct your private investments, you are not going to move that capital, very efficiently or effectively, or maybe you are just going to, wait for your kids. There's no time limit to these things, which of course has created all this controversy on Capitol Hill about what to do with DAFs. But what we're saying is, you could allow your DAF manager, say Fidelity, to put that capital in Wall Street, S&P index fund and get 4% or whatever you can get. Or you could deploy it in a deal that, could achieve that same market rate of return, or, some of our deals produce an alternative rate of return far north of that, while going to a company, mostly for profit. A nonprofit could do a deal that produces revenue, but most of our companies are for-profit companies that are solving some of the world's biggest problems. And so you get the benefit of being on purpose with your capital with an entrepreneur who you admire. And we're asking you, by the way, not to just deploy your capital, but to deploy your talent in your other forms of capital, your intellectual capital, your social capital, to help us win in fighting mental illness or fighting affordable housing battles or whatever else we're doing with our deals, financial inclusion plays. And as I say, solving some of the biggest problems. We're in the Middle East, investing in Israeli and Arab partners. The world sees the West Bank as hopeless, a zero-sum game of whose side are you on. Our entrepreneurs are Israeli and Arab, either Palestinian or Israeli Arab, and they're building businesses together because they want a better neighborhood. They want to create more opportunity for their kids while they still disagree on where the border should be written. Right. And so it's pretty exciting work.
It's really great. And another area I know of focus is second chance employment for former prisoners.
The prison entrepreneurship program in Texas is amazing. They've produced 3,000 graduates from 5 Texas prisons, 100% of whom have been employed 90 days upon release, which is just an insane statistic. There's about 8% recidivism. So of course there's failure, but enormously successful. PEP, as Arthur Brooks has written, is about a startup life more than startup businesses. They learn entrepreneurship pre-release, but it's really to breathe into these men, returning citizens, the dignity that they've lost or in some respects never really felt in their own life experience. And so they can look you in the eye at the end and leave prison with confidence to navigate society much more successfully than otherwise. But of the 3,600 actually have built businesses, and a handful of those are, $1 million plus annual revenue businesses. And so we held a Shark Tank at the George W. Bush Presidential Library, and then the Houston Country Club. And this year we're back in Dallas, and we're placing direct investments into these businesses. We don't have time to tell a couple of those stories, but they're super impressive. And but we also built a bank called Entree Capital. The winner of our first competition had a $3 million gross revenue, $300,000 net profit first year of operation. And that's what resulted in him being selected as the winner of our competition. Very impressive West Texas oil business. Yet after that financial performance and after winning this fancy Shark Tank at the Bush Library, he went to get a loan at the bank for a second truck and was denied because of his felony. So we create Entree Capital as a community development finance institution, or CDFI. We just received that status. And underwriting requirement for Entree Capital loans is that you must have a felony. So we're lending just to our graduates.
That's fantastic. That's all very, very innovative. So I'll end with this question, Jay. Do you have any fears about, you mentioned some of the legislation or reforms that have been proposed, even if they're not in the form of bills yet, around DAFs? Do you have any fears that those might suffocate some of the innovation that you all are practicing with your?
Yeah. I mean, for sure. I mean, I wouldn't call them fears as much as there's just threats. And the last 10 minutes of conversation about how to innovatively deploy this capital to enliven the giver's experience and to solve big problems is not the conversation Congress is having. That's more the vision Dan Coates called for in 1994 in the Project for American Renewal. So we think we're living out that legacy, but but they're seeing it in a reductionist sort of way and trying to put restrictions and top-down, redirection policies they're very threatening. So good work of the Philanthropy Roundtable and our other friends are, guarding, best they can, and it matters. The good news is, regardless of what Congress does, citizens can persist in innovation. So we'll keep at it. But this is why upstream and downstream matters. We have to stay in the fight upstream to make sure that policy enables the healthiest downstream activity that we can perform. But, the game's played downstream. And so we simultaneously need to help our entrepreneurs and investors be smarter, have higher expectations, and execute better. And that's just a day-to-day work that Sagamore and Commonwealth is really honored to be a part of.
Very good. Jay Hein, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, it was great fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate the conversation. You can find out more about Jay and Sagamore and Commonwealth at sagamoreinstitute.org. Everything is there. So again, thank you, Jay. Appreciate it. And good luck to you with all your work.
Well, I love the work that you're doing, Jeremy, with your team. And Commonwealth's website, by the way, is commonwealthimpact.org. So, these are two separate entities. They work in harmony on the inside of our operation, but externally they serve different audiences. So sagamoreinstitute.org or commonwealthimpact.org.
Great. Thank you. Very good. All right, Jay, take care. Thank you.